Okay, I wanted to go over the agenda briefly. We're going to have some opening remarks from Heather Tuga, who is our DEQ's Western Region Water Manager. And then I'm going to give an overview of implementing TMDL loads. And then we're going to have a Q&A session after that. Following that, Chance is going to give a high-level overview of the new requirements for the Willamette Subbasins and the Lower Columbia Sandy Temperature TMDLs that were recently approved. And then we'll have a Q&A after that as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce Heather Tuga. She is DEQ's acting Western Region Water Quality Manager, where she oversees stormwater, water integration, and TMDL and non-point source staff. So she's going to kick things off today with opening remarks. Heather, are you all set?
Yeah.
Great.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. Just really appreciate everybody joining us to learn more about the temperature TMDLs and the associated implementation actions. And I first want to start by recognizing and thanking the DMAs for the tremendous work you've done over the years to implement the earlier temperature TMDLs, such as the 2005 Sandy and 2006 Willamette Basin TMDLs. Cities, county, partner agencies, watershed councils, and soil and water conservation districts have really driven impressive restoration efforts, from streamside projects that improve riparian habitat to passage projects that reconnect salmon with their historical spawning grounds. And together, these efforts are making meaningful difference, improving water quality and strengthening aquatic ecosystems for many species, including the iconic salmonids that Oregonians and tribal communities have relied on for generations. So thank you for all your previous work. I also want to address why DEQ undertook this effort when we already had temperature TMDLs. The new temperature replacement TMDLs were developed to meet litigation requirements, and in 2013, due to court decision, EPA had to disapprove the natural conditions criterion, which most TMDL issues between 2003 through 2012 were based on. And the courts required DEQ and EPA to replace 15 Oregon temperature TMDLs that were based on the disapproved natural conditions criterion, and to reissue temperature TMDLs based on the biological temperature needs of salmonids. And so this was a significant shift. It means that DEQ can no longer use the natural conditions criterion to account for elevated stream temperatures when developing wastewater permit limits or setting non-point source targets such as shade goals. So even with these changes, shade remains at the center of our approach. The updated TMDLs continue to use effective shade as surrogate non-point source load allocation, and progress over time will primarily be measured by improvements in stream shading and corresponding stream temperatures. At the same time, DEQ recognizes that shade alone is not the only solution, and other strategies such as protecting flows, restoring stream channels, and reconnecting floodplains are equally important, and we strongly encourage DMAs to include these kinds of actions in their implementation plans. So along with the updated TMDLs, the Water Quality Management Plan now has new requirements that emphasize consistency in reporting. And in many cases, DMAs will be able to use the data you already have collected to help conduct streamside evaluations. So this is not about starting from scratch, and although DEQ recognizes that for some DMAs, this will be a heavy lift. For the largest DMAs, this includes Oregon Department of Forestry, Oregon Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service. There will be additional requirements because of their larger footprint in the Willamette and Sandy basins. We also have new requirements that apply to dam and reservoir owners. And so as always, your basin coordinators are available to answer questions and provide support. So please don't hesitate to reach out to them. And with that, I'm going to hand things back to Andrea, who will walk you through an introduction to implementing TMDLs. Then Chance will provide a high-level overview of the new Temperature Water Quality Management Plan requirements. And finally, I want to note that DEQ will be developing additional webinars to dive deeper into the specifics of the new requirements. And thanks again for all you do.
Thank you, Heather. I also want to reiterate our appreciation to all the DMAs that are listening in today. You've been implementing TMDLs it's been like 20 years now. It's been a long time, and we really appreciate all the work that's been done. And we also appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days. There's a lot going on right now. So we really appreciate you taking the time to listen in for a couple hours about these new TMDLs. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. I'm doing an overview of implementing TMDLs because we do have a number of different types of people participating today. So it's going to be a high-level overview. So who will benefit from this presentation? A lot of different types of people, actually. So many of you have been existing DMAs since the 2006 Willamette Basin TMDL and the 2005 Sandy TMDLs. But you may have new staff that have come on board and are still learning about the TMDL program. And even if you've written TMDL implementation plans before, these new temperature replacement TMDLs contain new requirements to keep in mind. And some of you may be new DMAs who haven't written a TMDL implementation plan before. And this presentation is meant to give you some background on why these plans matter and what they should include. So what is a TMDL? TMDLs are the maximum amount of a pollutant a water body can receive and still meet state water quality standards. DEQ analysts at our headquarters office, and sometimes in collaboration with EPA staff, first collect or they assess existing data and then conduct a pollutant source assessment. Modeling allows DEQ to figure out how much pollutant load to assign to point and non-point sources of pollutants, and then they assign pollutant loads to those sources. The same non-point source load allocation can be assigned to all non-point sources. For example, cities or counties, ag or forestry sources. And that can be at the basin or sub-basin scale. Sometimes these load allocations are developed based on surrogate measurements. So for example, the temperature TMDLs, the surrogate is percent effective shade. For the mercury TMDL for the Willamette Basin, the surrogate was total suspended solids. DEQ basin coordinators then write the water quality management plan to meet the TMDL pollutant allocations. The water quality management plan also names responsible persons and DMAs and describes requirements, including recommended or required BMPs to include in the DMA TMDL implementation plans. So why do TMDLs matter? It's to protect the beneficial uses of Oregon's water bodies. As part of implementing the TMDL program in Oregon, DEQ first determines the beneficial uses of water bodies to protect. Water quality standards are then developed to protect those beneficial uses. The most sensitive beneficial uses, such as the protection of human health or the ability to safely consume fish and shellfish caught in Oregon's waters, or being able to safely swim. And you can see from this middle photo, this was from the Big Float event. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a wonderful event that happened for a number of years in downtown Portland, where people got out and it's encouraging people to get down to the river and swim. Wonderful event. So that's an example of protecting beneficial uses of swimming. Another sensitive beneficial use is for aquatic life, and usually it's based on salmonids. Salmonids need high quality water, dissolved oxygen, pH requirements, and temperature requirements. Since many of our water bodies have these sensitive beneficial uses need higher or more conservative water quality standards. And for those reasons, our TMDLs are generally based on these most sensitive beneficial uses and the water quality standards to protect those uses. Here's a diagram of generally the TMDL process. So starting from left to right, DEQ assesses data, either that they collect or third parties collect, different agencies collect. There's specific quality assurance around that data to ensure that the data we are using to assess our water bodies are of high quality. We take a look at that data, and our assessment folks then make a determination on whether water bodies are meeting specific water quality standards. If they are not, it goes on our 303D list, which is a list of impaired water bodies. If a water body gets on the 303D list, a TMDL plan needs to be developed. So that's when we move into TMDL and water quality management plan development. The next step after this development, if an agency or entity gets named as a designated management agency, then a TMDL implementation plan is needed. And that's more of the focus of this presentation today. So once DMAs develop their plans to meet the non-point source load allocations, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, part of all of this too is the monitoring and adaptation that comes along the way. So we are monitoring the different BMPs that are occurring on the landscape and within the water systems. We're also looking at water quality data to see how the data is responding to BMPs. So it's a continuous process of adapting over time and tracking this progress. Point and non-point sources of pollutants in a TMDL. I think probably many of you are familiar with these, but I'll just briefly review. So non-point sources generally are diffuse types of pollutants that flow over land. It can also come from changes in physical conditions, such as an increase in solar radiation, which can happen if trees are removed, for example, along a waterway. So increased solar exposure, which can increase stream temperatures. Reduced stream flow can also cause pollutants to concentrate as well or make temperature worse. When in a TMDL, when non-point sources are identified, they're assigned a load allocation. Those load allocations are addressed in DMA TMDL implementation plans. There's also point sources that can be identified in TMDLs as being a source of TMDL pollutants. So you can think of point sources as coming from a pipe. Another way of thinking of it is a permit, any discharge that needs a permit. And these are some examples that you're familiar with. The 1200C, which is a construction stormwater permit. We have the MS4 permit, municipal stormwater permit, and permits around discharges from wastewater treatment plants or industrial discharges. So when a TMDL identifies point sources, it's called a waste load allocation that they give, and then those waste load allocations are addressed in permits. And then another clarification, so when any of you have submitted TMDL plans to basin coordinators, that's what we are reviewing for regulatory purposes. Our permitting staff at DEQ review permits to ensure that those waste load allocations are incorporated correctly into permits. So your role in TMDLs as a DMA, many of you today, you could be from cities, counties, state or federal agencies, basically any kind of entity that has legal authority over a sector or a source contributing pollutants. So 3 different actions that I wanted to focus on today are these 3 right here. So as a DMA, you develop a TMDL implementation plan to meet the load allocations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. There's also reporting required. We require annual reporting as well as a year 5 review. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I also wanted to emphasize the importance of public planning and collaborating with watershed partners. And I'll have a slide on that. The TMDL implementation plan components can be found in our Oregon administrative rules. It's these 5 components right here. The first is identifying management strategies to address the non-point source, the load allocations that are given. Typically, water quality management plans include tables on recommended, sometimes required strategies for DMAs to implement. Generally, we do look to DMAs to make the determination of which strategies will be the best suited for what they do. So we will be looking at that in TMDL implementation plans. We also look at timelines for implementing strategies and a schedule for completing measurable milestones when appropriate. A lot of times these timelines are provided in reporting matrices that many DMAs attach to their TMDL plan. And that contains a list of the different BMPs and strategies that the DMA will be implementing. And that's where we ask for those different timelines, when it will be done, how many times a year does that happen. So that's a good place to put timelines. We also provide for performance monitoring. And this is mainly around our annual reporting and our year 5 reviews, where there's an opportunity to update TMDL implementation plans. The 4th one, provide evidence of compliance with applicable statewide land use requirements. This one has changed over the past couple years. DMAs are no longer required to demonstrate compliance with these statewide planning goals. These goals come from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. The expectation is that cities and counties are complying with these statewide land use requirements. What's changed is that you're no longer required to provide that evidence to DEQ. The 5th is providing any other analyses or information specified in the water quality management plan. So that could include, as I have examples in here, cost estimates or fiscal analysis to implement your strategies, posting your TMDL plan and annual reports to websites when possible. There could be specific management strategies, such as the Mercury TMDL, where we had specific stormwater control management measures to implement, public involvement as well. So it's really important to review new water quality management plans to see what any new requirements are contained in the water quality management plan. DEQ staff also develop a TMDL approval checklist where we add any new water quality management plan requirements to that checklist. So I think that's also helpful for DMAs to have, so you can take a look at that to make sure you're meeting all the components, because there can be a lot of different requirements, especially the more TMDLs that you're a DMA for. TMDL reporting. We have annual reports and year 5 reviews. Chance also is going to talk about this a little bit, but I wanted to focus on a few things here. Under annual reports, it is required to have an annual report every year, and all the DMAs should have their deadlines of when they need to submit those reports to us. It's not necessary to have really long annual reports. We don't necessarily want DMAs to spend a lot of time doing their annual reports. what's important is that it's relevant and that it's reporting on the implementation actions that you had committed to in your implementation plan. So that's really what we're looking for. What did you say you were going to do last year, and what did you do? So again, for some of you that maybe have more robust programs, your annual reports might be a little longer than maybe a small city. So I just, kind of keeping this in mind. It's relevant. What's important is what's important, not how long it is. Some DMAs, especially if you're small, just may use the reporting matrix table for reporting. So again, the reporting matrix table, which many DMAs have as part of their TMDL plan, that has the list of all the different BMP strategies or policies that you're implementing. And you can just use that for reporting. But for some DMAs, if you especially have different restoration projects going on, you have other types of capital improvement projects, other types of projects. It's really nice to see photos from, say, a riparian restoration project that you did last year. So submitting photos, or I know sometimes different articles might be around streamside shade or stormwater that are included in newsletters to the public. Including links to those newsletters is really nice for basin coordinators to take a look at. It's also okay to include projects that you helped fund or provided technical assistance, even if you didn't do the work yourself. So for example, if you're providing money to watershed councils, to do work, or you're providing some kind of technical assistance to a watershed council or some other watershed partner, that's good to report on in your annual report, even if you didn't implement the project yourself. Water quality monitoring results. Many of you are not required to collect water quality data. Some of you, especially if you have an MS4, there are water quality monitoring requirements. I would encourage you, if you are collecting water quality, especially in-stream water quality data that is relevant to the TMDL, that TMDL parameter. If you're collecting that, you can share that information in your TMDL plan. Or if it's, for example, under your MS4 report, you can point to where that's found, and basin coordinators can take a look at that. It's also really important in your annual report to, if note any delays or challenges in meeting any of your strategies or timelines. Things happen and we understand that. Sometimes you might lose a position, or you don't have funding, or that grant you thought you were going to get to do that restoration project fell through. Mention that in your annual report. It gives the basin coordinators context of maybe why something didn't get done on time. And you can combine, for those that are MS4s, you can combine your MS4 and TMDL annual reports. Many have been doing that for a while. The TMDL basin coordinators review the TMDL implementation annual reports, while our MS4 staff would be reviewing the MS4 annual reports. Year 5 reviews. So every 5 years, DMAs are required to update their TMDL plans. And we are on a set 5-year schedule for most parts of the Willamette. Definitely for Northwest Region, we're on the same 5-year schedule for both the Northwest Region part of the Willamette and the Sandy Basin. And you can see that schedule there. Our next year 5 review would be in 2028. And just noting that anytime there's a new TMDL relevant to these areas, we follow the same 5-year schedule. So we don't have all these different 5-year schedules for each TMDL that you're a DMA for. So it's the same 5-year schedule. It's the time when you're updating your TMDL plan and you update the reporting matrix table for new or continuing strategies and milestones for the next 5 years. We also have an online survey that the DMAs fill out. So DEQ staff will then review and approve the updated plans and then make a determination on whether sufficient progress was made over the last 4 years by reviewing annual reports. Public participation is a key part of implementing TMDL plans. It not only gives community members a chance to provide input on DMA plans, but also serves as a way to communicate DMA responsibilities for protecting water quality and building public support. And successful implementation also requires financial resources, as you all know. Watershed councils, and I think I've seen a few watershed councils on the webinar today, which I'm really happy you're able to make it. The councils are valuable partners for engaging private landowners, implementing projects such as riparian restoration on private lands, and that can be really challenging. And yet it's really critical for achieving progress. Couple of things to keep in mind. So the Willamette Subbasins and the Sandy Temperature TMDLs replace our older temperature TMDL. So from the Willamette Basin from 2006, and for the Sandy, the 2005 TMDL. The temperature TMDL for the Willamette Subbasin, though, doesn't apply to the Tualatin or Yamhill Subbasins. Similarly, the water quality management plans for the Molalla Pudding and the Willamette, parts of it also don't apply because our temperature and mercury requirements were replaced by updated TMDLs. So the temperature one for the Willamette, updated this year in 2025, and the mercury requirements from the mercury TMDL in 2019. And also to keep in mind, the water quality management plan for the Sandy, the bacteria requirements from 2005 were combined with the temperature water quality management plan. So they are together now. Nothing changed in the bacteria requirements at all though, but they were combined. So DEQ does need to make some updates to our website to make this clear because it can be a little confusing. And so we are planning on making some updates here. So where to find all these TMDL related documents? Again, we're making some updates to our website. So it's going to look much better in a month or so. But here's the website to find the temperature TMDL related documents, the yellow highlighted area right there. If you click on that, it leads you to this page. And in the green highlighted box down there, there's a lot of different documents to go through. So the first one's going to have all the various TMDL documents, the technical support documents, and the water quality management plan. That second bullet with the interactive map and GIS data, I highly encourage you to go there and look. It's a really nice map. It shows where the DMA jurisdictions are. If shade gap modeling was done, that shows that there as well. So I highly encourage you to check that out. Similarly, for the Sandy TMDL, it's set up the same way. And there's the green box again to find all those relevant documents related to the Sandy TMDL. So I am at the end of my presentation. I think we have some times for some Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my presentation though, because I only have one screen and I can't see people. So now I can see everyone. And so Sarah, I don't know. I haven't been able to see the chat. I don't know if we've had any questions come in. Um,
Yeah,
doesn't,
not yet. I threw
okay.
a couple links to the website that Andrea was talking about in the chat for your reference. And it looks like Zachary got a question from you. Feel free to unmute.
Thank you. I was wondering about this potential to combine the annual reports between MS4 and TMDL. I was wondering how many DMAs do this and what that submittal looks like in terms of there's recent YDO updates to submit MS4 reports electronically. Would that potentially mean the TMDL annual report is submitted as an attachment within that? Just any thoughts on how people go about doing that?
That's a great question. So I'll answer the second part first. So far, the TMDL program is not in YDO. I think at some point in the future, we're going to get there. I don't know when that is yet. So that's a really good question. So in the past, how I've seen it, a lot of DMAs that I work with are also have MS4 permits as well. So what they might do is have an MS4 report, and then they might have an appendix at the end for the TMDL report. And so they submit it both to the MS4 staff. So some of you work with like Pablo Martos or Ryan Johnson. They'll review the MS4 annual report, and then I'll review the TMDL annual report. And then
Okay.
yeah, go ahead. So you can do that, but that's a really good question. And I think I have gotten this question before. So if you have to submit to YDO, I wouldn't see it. The TMDL basin coordinators wouldn't see it. So I think in the interim, you might have to just still send an email until such time DEQ basin coordinator staff can access YDO.
Okay.
Does that help? I know it's not a
Yeah,
perfect answer.
it's just something we've been kind of chewing on. So I'm just interested to hear how that might work out. But no, that makes perfect sense. And I do have a quick little follow-up on that same question. There's things within your reporting. I'm thinking of like public outreach events, for example. So we track what could apply to residents in our MS4 area. And then we also report on that in our TMDL plan basin wide. But we try to separate these metrics, and that can be challenging. Does it seem like the MS4 program would generally be accepting of the idea of reporting basin wide for the MS4 report? I hope that makes sense. Like, we're, our TMDL implementation area covers our MS4 area.
Mhm.
So if we're applying outreach to the basin, it would be inherent that that outreach is being provided in MS4. But right now we try to separate those two. I don't know how the MS4 program would feel about us saying, well, this is all the outreach we did basin wide.
It can be confusing. I know sometimes with the MS4 and the TMDL, think of it more as the TMDL implementation plan. They're implementing non-point source strategies that wouldn't be part of the MS4 permit. So thinking of riparian strategies or septic system work, things like that. So the TMDL plan tends to focus, on those non-point source strategies. There's some things under the MS4 permit, I think, in reporting, which could also relate a little bit to non-point source, like sometimes the education. So sometimes they can blend together a little bit. Um, but the goal is really under the MS4 reporting, and I'm not the MS4 people, so I don't like to speak for them, but it's really around your permit requirements and then which incorporates the waste load allocations, and then the TMDL implementation plan, which incorporates the load allocations and those BMPs under those to implement the load allocations. So it tends to be more riparian related, stream restoration, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Okay.
that helps so much.
No, I know it's kind of broad. There are some areas of clear overlap, and then others are separate. So we'll chew on this idea. I appreciate it.
Okay, sure thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions in the chat. So, Andrea, I think you'll be able to answer this one. A couple of folks are asking about where to find the DEQ checklist that you mentioned in the presentation.
Yes, so thank you for that. We're still updating that for the temperature replacement TMDL. So we have a draft already. And again, the point of those checklists is to make it easier for a DMA because it can be hard to catch all the requirements in those water quality management plans. So again, the idea is that we add those to a checklist. But we will send it out to you. It's in a draft form right now, but we can send it out to you when that's completed.
Thank you. We've got a question. Did I hear this correctly? DMAs no longer demonstrate compliance with Oregon land use. No Lux.
Yeah, we didn't need Lux around the TMDL plans. It's a little different. I think it's more like with permitting. I'm not an expert on that. But yeah, this is a more recent development. The key is in the plans, you're no longer required to demonstrate evidence with compliance. Whether you are or not with DLCD, that's really between you and that agency. It should be, you should be in compliance with statewide land use goals. It's just what's different is that you don't have to provide that evidence to DEQ in the TMDL plans.
Great. And then the next question, isn't there a high percentage of small communities being exempt from MS4?
I'm not sure. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I don't know that answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can share some contact information for our MS4 colleagues that would be able to answer that better. I don't believe they're on the webinar today. And then one more question in the chat. If jurisdictions share water quality data with TMDL coordinators, what is that data used for?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not a specific use for it. I think what it can do is provide additional information. So the TMDL plans, you're implementing these BMPs across the jurisdiction. If you're collecting water quality data related to that specific TMDL, so say you're implementing a TMDL for bacteria, or it could be mercury, temperature, having that data, I think, can give DEQ an idea of, what is the current situation within that jurisdiction. If we see, for example, that water quality data is looking really good, quote unquote, and meeting water quality standards, and maybe information we have show that it's impaired, we might encourage you to submit that to DEQ through a formal process to get it into our DEQ lab and Aquam, so it's formally assessed as part of our integrated report. But it's mainly just providing additional data, like basin coordinators wouldn't do anything specific with it. Unless some of the other basin coordinators have other ideas here, I invite other people to chime in here.
I would just echo what you said about if the data is showing something interesting or different than what we're seeing on our end, the next step would be to encourage you to submit it as part of our assessment process. And we could help you walk through that, submitting those data in the way they need to be submitted so that they can make it into our Aquam's database, which is our online database for water quality data.
Thanks, Priscilla.
All right, any additional questions at this time? We'll have another chance for Q&A after Chance's presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Chance, do you want to go ahead and start sharing your presentation?
Sure, thank you, Andrea.
Okay.
All right, can everybody see that? Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chance Plunk. I'm the TMDL basin specialist with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Today, I'll be walking you through the key timelines, the milestones, and reporting requirements for implementing the Willamette Subbasins Temperature TMDL. We'll focus on what's expected, by when, and how progress is tracked. And if we could please save questions for the end, I'd appreciate it. Okay, so Andrea gave an overview of kind of the TMDL, and so now we'll dive into the Water Quality Management Plan, or the WQMP. We'll discuss the implementation requirements, specifically the streamside evaluation, the shade gap analysis, or the buffer option, and then reporting. And then we'll touch on adaptive management strategies, long-term goals, and then I'll finish with a summary. At that time, I'll open the floor for questions and discussion. So this slide here, it outlines the core implementation requirements under the new temperature TMDL. So first, all responsible persons, including DMAs, must submit their TMDL implementation plan within 18 months of EQC adoption, which makes the due date November 9th, 2026. These plans must include clear management strategies, timelines, measurable milestones, and a process for performance monitoring. And by May 9th, 2028, each DMA must complete and submit a streamside evaluation. This applies even if you've chosen to implement a 120-foot buffer rather than conducting a shade gap analysis. If you're required to do a shade gap analysis or choose that option, you must submit your methodology for it by November 9th, 2026. That same date the same date that applies if you're adopting the buffer approach. By November 9th, 2030, the shade gap analysis or the 120-foot buffer must be fully implemented. Large dam and reservoir operators also have a November 9th, 2026 deadline for their own implementation plans. So each designated management agency or DMA must submit an implementation plan by November 9th, 2026. These plans must outline management strategies and BMPs that are designed to meet the non-point source load allocations of the temperature TMDL. Plans must also include timelines and measurable milestones for implementing these strategies and BMPs. Most DMAs already have an implementation plan for temperature. Implementation plan update they will submit by November 9th, 2026 will include additional information about the streamside evaluation. For some DMAs, the updated plan will also include information about reservoir monitoring requirements, which will be discussed in a later slide. All implementation plans will be updated again after completion of the streamside evaluation. For most DMAs, this will coincide with your Year 5 review. DEQ uses a TMDL plan approval checklist to determine if submitted implementation plans meet the requirements of the TMDL Water Quality Management Plan. This checklist can be made available upon request to act as a guidance document as you're developing these implementation plans. So what is the difference between a streamside evaluation and a shade gap analysis? Streamside evaluations use remote and field-based inventories to document the riparian vegetation to assess whether conditions are adequate to provide shade on the stream. They help us kind of identify where restoration opportunities exist. Where your shade gap analyses, on the other hand, are GIS and model-based. They calculate the difference between the shade that currently exists and the target effective shade, essentially quantifying how much solar loading reduction is needed. In short, the evaluation is an on-the-ground inventory, while the shade gap analysis is a model calculation. And I'll address each one of these individually on the following slides. The streamside evaluation, as I said, due May 9th, 2028. The goal of the streamside evaluation is to identify areas along streams that currently have the potential for increased shade and temperature reduction through riparian protection or restoration. This effort helps quantify current streamside conditions and sets the stage for defining site-specific riparian restoration goals. DEQ's expectation is that DMAs prioritize and focus streamside restoration and protection in those areas where we have identified the biggest shade gaps. In other words, we want to see implementation happening where we really need shade on streams. However, we recognize that there are on-the-ground constraints or hurdles to implementation. The streamside evaluation gives DMAs the opportunity to use real-time on-the-ground information to develop a rationale that supports implementation goals for each DMA. The streamside evaluation. This is a required component of the TMDL implementation plan. Its purpose is to review current riparian conditions and provide data that supports measurable objectives, timelines, and milestones for implementation. If DEQ has already completed a shade gap analysis for your jurisdiction, or if you're required to complete one yourself, those results must be included in your streamside evaluation. The evaluation must quantify the number of acres needing enhancement, such as areas not meeting shade targets, dominated by non-native vegetation, or needing additional planting, the number of acres that may only require protection, the number of acres with physical constraints, like buildings that prevent vegetation management or shade, or the number of acres with jurisdictional constraints, such as private property that limit shade providing actions. It must also identify opportunities to overcome these constraints, whether through partnerships, barrier removal, or funding efforts. In addition, you'll need to identify any potential areas for best management practices, such as in-stream restoration, flow augmentation, experimental temperature management, or enhancing cold water refuges. And then finally, the evaluation should prioritize implementation areas based on this information, focusing on locations with the largest shade gaps, unless constraints make that impractical. The rationale, data sources, and methods used to determine these priorities must be documented. DEQ recognizes that natural factors like climate change, geology, soils, wildfires, and floods can limit shade potential. Reductions in shade from these events won't trigger enforcement, but affected areas should still be assessed and prioritized for restoration. The streamside evaluation must be completed by the date in Table 8 of the Water Quality Management Plan and will play a key role in the Year 5 review, helping assess progress toward meeting implementation goals in the next 5-year cycle. DEQ understands that there may be more technical questions regarding how to complete a streamside evaluation. So we will be holding another webinar in November, providing a detailed walkthrough of how to complete that. And this webinar is more intended toward an introduction to these requirements. Okay, so a shade gap analysis is a modeling approach. It compares the current effective shade to the target effective shade. This analysis uses GIS, aerial imagery, on-the-ground data, and models to quantify the difference or the gap between current and target effective shade and helps determine the extent and priority of riparian planting or restoration needed to close that gap. So the Oregon Department of Forestry, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service are the only DMAs that are being specifically required to complete a shade gap analysis. These entities together manage or regulate about 93% of the land within 150 feet of streams in the Willamette Subbasins project area. Increasing shade on streams within the extensive areas within their jurisdictions is important to achieving the surrogate shade measures of this TMDL. As I stated before, this approach is used to identify where riparian vegetation is not currently meeting shade targets and where restoration is needed. These previous mentioned agencies must complete a shade gap analysis for those areas where DEQ has not already conducted one for their jurisdiction. The process includes two critical milestones. First, a project plan and a description of the assessment methodology, which is due November 9th, 2026. Then the full shade gap analysis must be completed and submitted by November 9th, 2030. DMAs that complete a shade gap analysis must also complete a streamside evaluation. So this slide covers the 120-foot buffer option described in section 5.3.3 of the Water Quality Management Plan. DEQ conducted a literature review of scientific research and found that potential stream shade loss associated with a 120-foot buffer will not cause stream temperatures to increase for most water bodies. This review is captured in DEQ's technical support document of the TMDL. While this approach may not be one most DMAs will implement, it is an option. DMAs may choose to implement a 120-foot streamside buffer that establishes and protects overstory and woody vegetation. This buffer must extend 120 feet landward from each side of the stream and must be supported by a regulatory or enforceable mechanism. If a DMA chooses to implement the 120-foot buffer option, they still must complete a streamside evaluation, which is the on-ground assessment of those existing conditions and constraints. But they're not required to run the technical modeling to compare current versus system potential shade. The buffer is accepted as an alternative path to achieving equivalent shade outcomes and would replace the requirement to complete a shade gap analysis. So when would a DMA choose or be required to go this route? Let's look at an example using the decision tree shown as figure 4 in the Water Quality Management Plan. Okay, so the decision support tree shown here and outlined in the Water Quality Management Plan is designed to help each DMA determine their specific responsibilities. For example, whether or not DMAs need to submit an implementation plan, streamside evaluation, shade gap analysis, or other analyses. Let's walk through this decision tree together. So let's start on the left. The first question asks whether you are one of those listed agencies, ODF, ODA, BLM, or USFS. So if the answer is no, we move to the next decision point. Are you a large dam owner listed in Table 7 as a DMA? If the answer is no again, we'll move on to the next question. Did DEQ complete a shade gap analysis for your jurisdiction? So we'll say no. If the answer to that question is also no, then according to the decision tree, that DMA is required to submit both a streamside evaluation and an implementation plan. So let's back up a little bit and say that DEQ did complete a shade gap analysis for your jurisdiction. So we say yes to did DEQ complete that shade gap analysis for your jurisdiction. And then we move on to the next question. Are you selecting to use DEQ's shade gap analysis? If yes, then you would submit your streamside evaluation and your implementation plan with the provided shade gap analysis. If the DMA decides not to use the shade gap analysis provided by DEQ, so you answer no to whether or not to use it, we move to the next decision block, the S. Are you selecting to implement and enforce a 120-foot streamside buffer? If implementing the buffer, then the DMA would submit a streamside evaluation and implementation plan along with the documentation. If the DMA says no, they are not implementing a 120-foot buffer, then the DMA would complete and submit their own shade gap analysis along with streamside evaluation and their implementation plan. So for large dam and reservoir operators, section 5.3.6 outlines specific requirements for large dam and reservoir owners, listed in Table 7 of the Water Quality Management Plan. These owners are required to submit a TMDL implementation plan focused on temperature monitoring. The deadline for this plan is November 9th, 2026. So dam and reservoir operators were designated as DMAs because they have direct control over activities that affect water quality, particularly flow, storage, and temperature conditions, Under Oregon's TMDL rule, DMAs must be entities with legal authority and responsibility to manage sources of pollution. And dam operators clearly meet that standard. Their facilities were identified as contributors to temperature and mercury impairments in the Willamette Basin, and they have both the jurisdiction and the ability to implement strategies such as operational changes or structural improvements to help meet the TMDL load allocations. These implementation plans must include a temperature monitoring strategy for monitoring how dam and reservoir operations affect downstream water temperatures, proposed management measures to address any identified impacts, and a schedule for implementing and reporting those measures. DMAs are required to submit annual reports to DEQ, track restoration projects in the Oregon Watershed Restoration Inventory, and participate in Year 5 reviews to evaluate progress. Together, these reports serve as progress checkpoints and ensure we're adapting as needed to meet water quality goals. I'll go into each one of these reporting requirements in more detail on the following slides. Each responsible person must submit an annual report to DEQ describing the implementation measures taken during the reporting year to meet the load allocations or surrogate measures in the TMDL, progress toward measurable milestones, and results of performance monitoring. The report must also identify implementation measures planned for the next year. OWRI, which stands for Oregon Watershed Restoration Inventory. This is a statewide database that tracks restoration projects, both voluntary and regulatory, across Oregon. For the temperature TMDL, submittals to OWRI are important because they help DEQ and other partners keep track of riparian restoration work that contributes to reducing stream temperatures. DMAs are responsible for making sure that all riparian restoration projects, even those carried out by partners or contractors, are submitted to OWRI. This reporting ensures there's a public record of what's been implemented, supports adaptive management, and helps DEQ evaluate the progress toward meeting TMDL goals during annual and 5-year reviews. Every 5 years, DMAs are required to review and revise their implementation plans. Concurrently, DEQ conducts a basin-wide review to assess progress. If targets are not being met, then plan revisions or additional measures may be required. This creates a structured checkpoint for evaluating the success and recalibrating those strategies. Many of you on the call today have participated in a Year 5 review already. DEQ plans to continue using our online questionnaire to collect Year 5 review data from DMAs. So the backbone of this framework is accountability through reporting and adaptive management. Implementation plans aren't static. They're expected to evolve as knowledge and technologies progress and improve, and if practices aren't effective, they must be adjusted. If entities fall short of requirements, DEQ has the authority to enforce corrective actions. DEQ enforces when DMAs do not meet their obligations under the TMDL and use a graduated approach, starting with notices and technical assistance, and then escalating to orders or penalties when necessary. The long-term goal is full attainment of the temperature standards is by 2120. We recognize that no one can know with certainty what conditions will look like in the year 2120. It is a long-term planning horizon chosen to reflect the time it takes for riparian forests to fully mature and provide maximum system potential shade. The 100-year time frame was selected to ensure that today's restoration and protection efforts are evaluated against a realistic period needed for a natural process to develop, while also providing a consistent benchmark for planning, tracking progress, and meeting water quality goals over the long term. So today's webinar serves as an introduction to the requirements outlined in the Temperature TMDL Water Quality Management Plan, providing an overview of those key expectations and deliverables for designated management agencies. A follow-up webinar is scheduled for November 12th. This will focus more deeply on the streamside evaluation requirement including a step-by-step guidance on completing the evaluation and demonstrations of the tools provided to support this work. Here I've provided a graphic on this slide that contains all the Willamette Basin coordinators, assigned subbasins, and their contact information. If you have questions or need assistance developing your implementation plans, I highly recommend that you contact the corresponding basin coordinator for your area. So thank you for your time and attention today. I'm happy to take any questions at this time that you have about timelines, requirements, or how these pieces fit together for the successful implementation of the temperature TMDL.
Thank you, Chance. I'm going to go to a question in the chat first. It is very cumbersome to report via the 5-year retrospective annual reports and also report everything through ORI. Is there some way to make this easier on DMAs? So much reporting. And I'll just open that up to any basin coordinator who'd like to comment on that.
Anyone? Any takers? So I'm not aware of any easier method. I don't know if Priscilla or anybody has anything additional to add to that.
Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah, I get it. It might feel like a lot of reporting. Annual reports, though, are necessary. We need to know if DMAs are implementing their strategies and their actions on time, and if they're not, what are those reasons? It's part of our adaptive management process. And so we need to know at least once a year what's happening out there in the watershed. The good news is, though, the year 5 review replaces the annual report. So it's not in addition to the annual report, it replaces the annual report. And something we have done to try and make that process easier is develop an online questionnaire. And so now instead of developing that report on your own, like we used to do years ago, you can use an online survey, where you're answering multiple choice questions. And our hope is that would make that process easier. And we know we've had some hiccups with administering that online survey, and we try and improve it incrementally every time we administer it. The ORI reporting, that's new. That is new, and that is like another level of work. But at DEQ, we don't have a database or a reporting system that lends itself to capturing restoration work. We tried to do that through the year 5 survey and found that it just was not an effective tool at capturing that type of work. And, OWEB's figured it out. They've got a tool that works. And we're actually talking with OWEB staff in the process of getting some of their staff to do a webinar for us and you to learn how to use their reporting system to upload this type of information. So it does represent another level of work, but we are working with OWEB to be able to provide some hopefully hands-on assistance and getting that information into ORI.
Yeah, thank you, Priscilla. We'll go ahead and go to Katie with your hand up.
Hi, thank you for this information. I have a clarifying question around the streamside evaluation and shade gap analysis timelines. So for like the city of Milwaukee, who might use, let's say, like DEQ's data, the analysis of that data, of the shade gap data, is due November 9th, 2030, but then our streamside evaluation that's informed by that DEQ data is due May 9th, 2028. Am I missing? So I feel like I'm missing something of the timeline there. Does that make sense?
So the stream, if I'm understanding correctly, so the streamside evaluation you would do first. That's your the on the ground. So your streamside evaluation actually fuels the data for your shade gap analysis. So okay. Vice versa on that. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks.
Great. So we'll go to some questions in the chat. Is the option to use the 120 streamside buffer option not available to DMAs if DEQ completed a shade gap analysis for that jurisdiction? That seems to be what the decision tree shows.
Yeah, so sure. So the only DMAs that are required to do the shade gap analysis are ODF, ODA, BLM, and U.S. Forest Service. So if you don't fall in one of those realms, then you aren't required to currently do the shade gap analysis. Sorry, can I see that question one more time?
Yeah, so I think that clarified, Chance. So it doesn't preclude a DMA from using the 120-foot streamside buffer if they choose. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Great. We've got a question about ORI. A couple. So doesn't ORI require that the project be of a certain size? And then another question about some of the information ORI requests is not available to us. So I think maybe I'll try and answer. We'll be having another webinar about ORI specifically, but does anybody know if can address those questions directly? I'm not familiar.
Yeah, I'm not familiar off the top of my head either for specific certain sizes. Priscilla or Grace or anybody have anything?
No, there's a good question. So we're talking with OWEB staff right now, and we'll take those back and figure that out. Make sure that we've got a workable tool for us moving forward. But good questions, noted, and we can follow up.
Great. I'll just note one more question in the chat, and then we'll go to some hands. Just a note that the streamside evaluation webinar will be on November 12th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. So the same time slot as today. And we'll go ahead and go to Andrew.
Thank you. I have a comment, and then there's a question. It's about the importance of restoring in-stream flows in places where they're depleted due to people and companies and governments pumping water out of the stream. And so, for example, during irrigation season in agricultural areas for irrigation flows, frequently the water's taken out and it just evaporates or evapotranspires and none of it goes back in. So in places like that, where the water supply in the creek compared to say 300 years ago, maybe there's only 10% of the water there used to be, or 20% of the water that there used to be in the irrigation season, that remaining little bit of water, it's just physics, it's going to heat up a lot faster and farther. We have a creek in it drains portions of Clackamas and Multnomah County. Sometimes the remaining little bit of water in that agriculture area gets up to 27 Celsius. So this is lethal to salmon and steelhead. So we West submitted a comment letter to DEQ during the TMDL development process. I looked it up. It's February 20th, 2024. And one of our comments was, please DEQ add State Water Resources Department to Appendix A and list them as a DMA. And so I've heard your words today, some of the words about in-stream flows, but it seems to me that it would be important for Water Resources Department to be, at the table, because they're not, and there's a disconnect. And so I hear some of the words, but why did you guys not tag Oregon Water Resource Department as DMA when Oregon Department of Forestry is at the table? They're doing their part. Oregon Department of Agriculture, they're a DMA, they're at the table. They have a lot of work to do, but I think they've been doing at least some of the work they need to do. And I don't see Water Resources Department. I don't think they're here today. I don't think they're really doing much. And for water temperature, flow, and the mass and the volume of the water is really important. So I don't know how we're ever going to accomplish our watershed health restoration goals and meet these biologically based numeric temperature criteria. I don't know how we're going to meet them without Water Resource Department not just being at the table, but rolling up their sleeves and doing what they can to make sure that we have these minimum in-stream flows. So why were they not added as a DMA?
I'll jump was going to jump in here because Chance didn't get to participate in the TMDL development process, but it was a good comment. We did receive that comment from more than one interested party during the public comment period. And we did reply to that in our response to comment. And so our response to comment that's on public record and available to our website, that is our response to that question. And it is just outside the scope of today's webinar. So I don't want to give the impression that it's not an important question. It is, we addressed it, but today's webinar is specific to implementation for DMAs who are named in the TMDL. Oregon Water Resources Department was not named in the TMDL. This forum is not for discussing the legitimacy of including them or not including them. That decision was made during the development process, and we addressed that in response to comments. And that's what I have to say to that comment. But if another basin coordinator and manager wants to add to that, I'll release the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla, and thanks for the question, Andrew. Totally understand the concern, and I will say that we are working with them outside of this process. We have the Integrated Water Resources Strategy, which is a statewide plan for how to address a lot of these very complicated issues. And I do agree that they do need to be partners with a lot of the projects that watershed councils, SWCDs, ODA will be working on. And so I agree, we do need to bring them to the table, but we can discuss offline why we did not include them as a DMA if you would like.
Yeah, thank you. We'll go ahead and go to Elizabeth.
Hi, you guys. Just can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Just a comment. Back to ORI. They had a pretty big threshold for restoration projects. I can't pull it out of my head, but I would encourage DEQ to